Hello, I'm Charles McKittrick, and this is a short video about my Spanish Civil War collection. I first read Hugh Thomas's The Spanish Civil War in 1962. It was fascinating. It was the first balanced book of general history that came out after the Spanish Civil War. Prior to that time, since 36 and 39, when the war took place, the books tended to be heavily propaganda. Since the time of the Spanish Civil War, there have been over 22,000 books written. Not only that many books, but there have been thousands of pamphlets, magazine articles, newspaper articles, journals, thousands of lines of publication. Now let's just define the war. The Spanish government, which had been elected in 1936, we will call the Republic. The generals who were attempting to overthrow the Spanish government we'll call the Nationalists. The war was an international war. Stalin and the Russians gave great support to the Republic. Germany and Italy gave great support to the Nationalists. The democracies pretended to stay neutral, but they were very divided within their own countries. The war was also a war that attracted an immense amount of volunteers. Thousands of men came from all over the world to fight in it, mostly on the Republican side, many refugees from Central Europe. The war was also a visual war. Photojournalism had come a long way, and the photographs taken, both at the front and behind the front, were seen all over the world in a matter of days. As well as art was produced, the famous Picasso Guernica, and movies, For Whom the Bell Tolls, just one example. The war was also very much a literary and passionate war. Writers all over the world took sides. They took polls in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in Spain as to which side the writers were on. Incidentally, they were 98% on the side of the Republic. The war also attracted a large number of writers to Madrid, which is in the hands of the Republic. And these people produced books and novels and movies. So the war remains relevant today, still producing editorials, news articles, and books. One of the most recent editorial was comparing the Spanish Civil War to the war in Syria. My collection contains over 1,500 books, about 35% in Spanish, as well as hundreds of pamphlets, magazines, journal articles, newspapers, and then some videos and recordings. So let's take a look at the collection. As we go through the collection, we're going to talk about books first, and then we'll talk about such things as pamphlets and newspapers and magazines. In the category of books, I have broken them down into various groupings that make sense. And the first selection is classics and general histories of the Spanish Civil War. These are books that are scholarly written. They have footnotes, index, bibliographies. And these, of course, include Hugh Thomas's famous Spanish Civil War, but also the works of Stanley Payne of the University of Wisconsin, who wrote 17 different books on the war and is one of the greatest minds on the subject. Jim Cortada, whose historical dictionary of the Spanish Civil War is an absolute must in every collection, as well as books by Helen Graham and Paul Preston, Burnett Bulletin, and many others, including Spanish authors. Most of the books are in good condition. They vary from first editions with dust jackets to very fragile 1930 type European well-thumbed paperbacks. The second category of books is more specialized, and it would be military books which go into much more detail on campaigns, maps, on the equipment, and on foreign involvement. In these books, for instance, there will be a book on training soldiers on how to learn how to fire machine guns and to dig trenches. There'll be another book on all the arms used in the war. That one happens to be over 600 pages by Garcia and Franco. There will be books on the Italian intervention in the war, books on the sea war, books on the aircraft of the war. The famous aircraft, the German Ju-52, is written up because it played a key role in parachuting the Moroccans into Spain in the early phases of the war. These books also include some very personal things, such as basic handbooks that the soldiers carried, and as well as personal accounts such as Alva Bessie's Men in Battle and various others. The third category is extremely important because, as we said earlier, the visual nature of the war made photography, art, and graphics very, very important. And so what we've tried to do is have as large a collection we can of the photography of Robert Capa, his girlfriend Gerda Taro, David Seymour, Hans Nemeth, and others. In addition, there are many less well-known names, such as Ray Villa, who published under the name SIM, who were famous for their revolutionary art. And we have a 1937 calendar by Ray Villa that is in the collection. Some of the very best artwork was done by the forces of the Republic, and this was done in Barcelona. But on the right, there were also very famous artists. Carlos Sáenz de Tejada did a great deal of work, and we have pictures of that in the history of the Crusade. Posters were also a major product of the Civil War. The collection does not have posters. Let me repeat that. The collection does not have posters. But what we do have is a whole series of books that reproduce the posters in color, index them to their author, and describe their subject. The Carula brothers of Barcelona have indexed and presented these posters, over 2,000 of them, in another book 1,000 of them. And there are other books, such as Shouts from the Wall. So you can get a good feel of the posters, even though we have no posters in the collection. Another very interesting part of this visual aspect of the war is illustrated histories. My experience has been that some folks want to view the photo histories to supplement their readings, but some would rather look at the pictures than read the books. And so we have a large number of excellent photo histories. They're very big books and published not only after the war, during, but also up to the last few years. One of the most recent to come out was Art Revolutionaries. And this particular book is showing the famous 1937 pavilion in the World's Fair in Paris, and the terrific art that was shown in the Spanish pavilion, including Picasso's famous Guernica. We've talked before about the literary aspects of the Spanish Civil War. One can get very busy collecting general histories, war histories, pamphlets, but it's very important to focus on the literature that came from the war. We're talking about the novels, we're talking about the poetry, we're talking about the literary criticism, and we have several hundred books that fall into this particular category. Of course, Ernest Hemingway's work, Fred Benson's famous book, Riders in Arms, and of course George Orwell's many essays, as well as Homage to Catalonia. Now, after the books, the general histories, the military histories, the visual photo histories and the literary histories, there are still many, many categories to cover. We have biographies, autobiographies. There must be 10 biographies of Franco, but then also biographies of all the major leaders of the war on both sides, as well as many of the other specialized areas of the war. It's a very interesting thing that Spanish Civil War books, history books, tend to have a glossary. And they have to have that glossary because there were so many factions on both sides that you need the glossary to remind you of who the factions were. Among these are the anarchists, you have the Carlists, who were a Catholic faction, you have the Catholic Church, you have the Falange, which was the fascist element within the nationalists. The Falange today is very much out of favor in this modern time, and yet they were very, very important in 1936 and 7, and the collection has a great deal of material on this particular group. Also sections on women in the war, sections written particularly for the youth, sections about the role of the church, and sections about refugees and the post-war area. In addition to this variety, there are a few items of what I call special interest. They're just things you don't normally find. For instance, I have one of the few books written in Yiddish on the Spanish Civil War. It was published in 1939 and contains 18 stories by graduates of a Bronx school, and these were about Jewish volunteers in Spain. We also have a very interesting book on the postcards, love postcards that Franco wrote to a woman he was enamored with when he was serving in Morocco. And then, of course, there's a very interesting book called The Lost British Policy by a Barbara Wertheim. Barbara Wertheim turns out to be Barbara Tuchman after she got married. But in her early days, before she was established, she wanted to take a stand and wrote a very complex book on British foreign policy and why it was going against 200 years of tradition. And in doing this, she produced a very, very interesting book without raising a lot of furor. Now, after the book categories, there are others that we want to very briefly step through. We have over 400 magazines. Now, magazines are interesting because they show you what was going on in real time during the war, and you can see how it was reported. And often the magazine work was accompanied by very excellent photography and eyewitnesses. And looking back at these articles written over 80 years ago, I think they did a good job of reporting for the most part. And you'll see great diversity in support between left and right. We've talked before about the explosion of photographic coverage, and of course that gets picked up in the magazines in a great way. And we have some of the original Kappa magazine articles, which were very, very interesting. In addition, we have a series of editions of Scholastic Magazine, American publication for high school students. And you can see how it reported to the high school students the Spanish Civil War in 36-37 period. In addition, we have magazines produced by the fascist group in Spain, which are excellent. Fortune magazine, Volunteer, magazine of the Abraham Lincoln Brigades. And then just recently we've acquired a year and a half of the New Masses, which was a very, very quality literary magazine published by the Communist Party in New York City, and had many writers writing for it, famous writers who were not communists. Here you can see writing from one part of view, as well as some excellent exhibits and editorials and cartoons. Newspapers are also interesting, particularly if you can have a run where you can see several months in a row of the newspaper coverage, because it's a different form of reading about the war, because you're reading about the war, but at the same time you're seeing what else is happening in the world. For instance, as they report on battles in Spain, you can see the Munich conference is taking place and Hitler is moving in on Czechoslovakia. We have many sets. One of them, the Frente Libertario, is an anarchist publication from Madrid from 36 to 38. And then we have also the Herald of Aragon, which is a nationalist publication in 37 and 38 that you can follow. But one of the absolutely most fascinating parts of any collection on the Spanish Civil War are the pamphlets. Pamphlets, George Orwell said, pamphlets are a one-man show. Pamphlet, usually you can fit in your hand, usually covers one topic very clearly. They're colorful, they have graphic appeal, and they leave very little doubt where the author stands. We have over 350 pamphlets in the collection. They're organized by major categories, such as international brigades, anarchists, the Republic, the Falange, nationalists, military campaigns, writers, church, the communists, the Carlists. Each pamphlet is in an acid-free slip and filed by categories. And we have some very interesting pictures that we can show of those pamphlets. One of our last categories are journals and journal articles. There's some people who won't read a book, but they'll read an essay or they'll read a journal article. And 20 years ago, I began collecting a variety of journal and journal articles by various writers. These very often are in political science or public affairs journals, such as the Wilson Quarterly, the National Interest, the Quadrant, the Left News, the Australian Journal of Politics and History, Contemporary European History, Journalism History. And these are top authors, such as we've talked about in the book section. The journals enable a reader to hone in on specific subjects and specific authors without reading some of the more complex books. Over the last 20 to 25 years, just as an aside, when I see a clipping in the newspaper or a magazine about the Spanish Civil War, I set it aside. And recently, I put these together and discovered that I had nearly 8 3-ring binders of articles that have appeared the last 20 years in newspapers and magazines about phases of the Spanish Civil War or people involved. I thought these were interesting. They're no substitute for good reading in books or in journals, but they show the relevance of the war because it's still being written about even today in the year 2019. Finally, we have phonograph records, CDs, and audio tapes. These are very, very interesting. They're from in all medium, 78 RPM, 45 RPM, 33 1/3 RPM, categories many people have not heard of, but they give a song, speeches from all nationalities. Pete Seeger, Woody Guthrie, songers from the German Condor Legion, and people singing in Yiddish. I hope this review of the collection has been of interest to you. There's also a written summary of the collection that goes into much greater detail that can be made available. Most of the collection is currently in a climate-protected storage. At some point, I'm going to want to find a home for the collection. Thanks for watching.